Welcome back to ArkanSense, where we try to make sense of the issues affecting Arkansans, and today we're going to talk about what's on the 2020 Arkansas ballot, specifically Issue 1, an amendment to the Arkansas Constitution continuing a 0.5% sales and use tax for state highways and bridges, county roads, bridges, and other surface transportation, and city streets, bridges, and other surface transportation after the retirement of the bonds authorized in Arkansas Constitution Amendment 91. So, Issue 1 it is. But what does Issue 1 do? Well, back in 2012, voters passed a constitutional amendment which created a 10-year sales tax increase of 0.5% to help pay for state highways and other roads. This tax applies to basically everything sold in the state except for groceries. That 10-year tax expires in 2022 unless Issue 1 passes, in which case the tax would become permanent and could only be changed or modified by another constitutional amendment. Currently, the state sales tax rate is 6.5%. So if this passes, that stays the same. If it doesn't and no other action is taken, the state sales tax rate would go down to 6%. So how does that money get spent? First of all, the money absolutely has to go to roads. The law is written so that the state couldn't collect the tax and then use it on something else. Out of the funds raised, about 70% of it goes to the Arkansas Department of Transportation, or DOT, who use it for construction and maintenance of things like state routes and interstates. The other 30% is split evenly between cities and counties who use it to upkeep certain roads within their respective limits. Of the amount that goes to the DOT, about 3/4 would go to road upkeep and 1/4 to building new roads. The amendment itself doesn't specify any particular projects, but the DOT has put forward some proposals as to how to use the funds. Here's a map that shows some roads to be repaved and bridges to fix, and here's a second map showing the next proposed phase of the Connecting Arkansas program, which includes widening and improvement of existing roads as well as building new ones. There are approximately 79,000 miles of roads currently maintained by the state, and the DOT says the funds from Issue 1 would go to the repair or upkeep of about 71,000 of those, and would pay for the repair or replacement of every bridge in the state that has been deemed structurally deficient. Issue 1 is part of a package of legislation put forward by Governor Hutchinson last year to raise $300 million annually for road construction and maintenance in the state. Act 1, if passed, would account for over 2/3 of that amount, with the rest coming from other tax revenue that's already in place. But why do the governor and the legislators who voted to put Issue 1 on the ballot say that we need it? First of all, Arkansas roads are in deep need of repair. The Federal Highway Administration puts out data on how worn down roads are based on the conditions of their pavement, and Arkansas has some of the worst in America by this metric. According to data from 2018, we rank 38th or lower in the categories of rural interstates, urban interstates, rural arterial roads, and urban arterial roads. The reason for it seems pretty clear if you look at spending per lane mile, or how much money each state spends on average to upkeep one lane of 1 mile of road. Arkansas, again, ranks near the bottom. It would be one thing if we were spending relatively little while still maintaining good road conditions, but that just isn't the case. Proponents of Issue 1 say this is a clear indication we need to invest more into this infrastructure. The governor also argues that when roads are only partially funded, money ends up being spent on the more trafficked urban areas, leaving rural roads without any support. According to him, Act 1, along with the other revenue sources, will ensure that the state has enough money to give rural roads the attention that they deserve. Supporters of Issue 1 also point to what will happen if it doesn't pass and the tax is allowed to expire. Remember how we said earlier that a chunk of this money goes to cities and counties? Those funds account for about 30% of city and county road spending. If Issue 1 doesn't pass, those places would either have to raise local taxes to make up the difference or stop a significant portion of their road work. It's also estimated that the tax supports approximately 3,600 jobs, and presumably those would end as well. Proponents of Issue 1 say that better roads are good for business. It's estimated that over the next 10 years, the proposed road improvements would bring in about $8.2 billion of additional economic activity. And some businesses clearly believe this as well. Two of the largest donors to the pro-Issue 1 campaign are J.B. Hunt and members of the Walton family, owners of Walmart. Both companies have a vested interest in both local infrastructure and in our interstates carrying their 18-wheelers. Finally, here's a rather new argument. We find ourselves right now in the midst of a pandemic, and as a result, people are leaving home less frequently. Regardless of how things play out, some jobs which have gone remote may also stay that way indefinitely, and that would mean a long-term decrease in fuel spending, which was already slowing down thanks to increasing average fuel efficiency and the spread of electric vehicles. All in all, revenue from gas taxes is likely to keep decreasing, and if we want to keep funding roads at the same level we are now, there may need to be another less risky revenue stream than gas taxes, and a sales tax could fit that bill. If you agree more with these arguments than the ones against it, you should vote for Issue 1. So now let's talk about those arguments against Issue 1. And while there are some folks who would argue against nearly any tax, let's just focus on why someone who agrees that you should pay some taxes might be against this tax specifically. One of the main arguments from folks opposed to Issue 1 is that the state shouldn't be directing so much money towards roads while at the same time largely ignoring public transportation needs. Surveys in both the Little Rock and Northwest Arkansas metro regions indicate that people want more public transportation, more bus routes, more shuttles, and extended hours for existing routes. And yet right now Rock Region Metro is in the process of cutting 10 routes, saying it has to do so to stay within its budget. And in Fayetteville, the options are Ozark Regional Transit with only 3 in-city routes, or Razorback Transit, which serves the university and severely reduces its hours and routes whenever school isn't in session. Some of the folks opposed to Issue 1 say it doesn't make sense to throw so much money at expanding existing roads or building new ones when we could instead fund the kind of public transportation that would decrease the need for some of those roads in the first place. There are also a number of people opposed to Issue 1 for environmental reasons. They argue that the construction and upkeep of the roads, as well as drivers on them, creates significant environmental pollution, and that money should instead be spent on funding more, greener public transportation, as well as eliminating the fees on electric and hybrid vehicles to encourage their purchase and use. For another argument against Issue 1, take a look at this chart, which shows the state sales tax plus the average local sales tax for each state in America. As of January 2017, Arkansas had the 3rd highest combined rate in the country, and those sales taxes apply to everyone, regardless of how much or how little they use the roads. Plus, sales taxes tend to hit poorer families harder. So, some opponents of Issue 1 do want the funds to be raised, but don't want it to be through a sales tax. They would rather let the sales tax increase expire and instead find the funds some other way, like through additional taxes on gas, vehicle parts, or on 18-wheelers and other large vehicles which damage the roads more per mile than the average person's car does. Another argument against Issue 1 has to do with the fact that the amendment does not include specifics on how the money has to be spent. While the DOT has put out its proposals on how to use the funds, there's no guarantee they will be used that way. And unlike its predecessor, Issue 1 doesn't come with a time limit, so Issue 1 effectively provides a large block of funds with few restrictions, and that makes some folks uncomfortable, as does the fact that it's a constitutional amendment, meaning it would be harder to repeal than a tax passed by the legislature. On the other hand, some folks are against Issue 1 because of a project it definitely will help fund, the 30 Crossing Project, which seeks to completely revamp the portion of Interstate 30 that goes through downtown Little Rock and across the Arkansas River. Opponents say that 30 Crossing is unnecessary and will damage the local environment. The project is already partially funded, but some of the remaining costs have to be covered from the tax revenue of Issue 1. 30 Crossing is the most expensive road project ever undertaken in our state, and some opponents think it may end up taking up a large share of the Issue 1 tax revenue, leaving very little for new construction in the rest of the state. And since Issue 1 has no specifics on how its funds have to be used, there's really no way to know, so some opponents say it's better to vote against Issue 1 in order to stop the 30 Crossing project. Finally, remember how earlier we talked about the unique challenges of 2020 and how some people might continue to work remotely even after the pandemic ends? Before, I'd said that if you want roads funded at the same level, it might make sense to use a sales tax to offset decreased gas tax revenue. But if there are going to be fewer people on the roads, maybe it makes more sense to not maintain that same level of spending. Fewer people on the roads means less wear and tear to repair, less congestion, and as a result, less need for widening and expansion projects like 30 Crossing. According to the U.S. Department of Transportation, as of May 2020, travel on Arkansas roads and streets has decreased 15.8% over the previous year. There's no way to know right now how much this will rebound or how long it will take, but opponents opponents would argue that it doesn't make sense to increase road spending without that information. And remember, repairs and new roads have other sources of funding, including the new casino tax revenue. Voting against Issue 1 doesn't eliminate that budget entirely, it just decreases it significantly. So if you agree with these arguments more than the ones that came before, you should vote against Issue 1. And that's it! Thanks so much for watching. If you enjoyed this video, consider liking and subscribing. I'll be putting out one more video soon explaining the final issue on the Arkansas ballot. And if you enjoyed this and want to see more videos like it, consider supporting ArkanSense on Patreon. Patreon is the easiest way to support content makers in a way that works for your budget. You decide how much you want to give each month, and you can change that amount at any time. Bigger donations get bigger perks, including picking a topic for an upcoming ArkanSense episode. And speaking of perks, thanks to patrons Zach Green, Jordan Little, Jason Sanders, Alan Archer, and W. Don Hughes, as well as everyone you see on screen now, for making this video happen. Thanks again, and see you next time for more ArkanSense.